From one watch to another, the Pittsburgh Penguins are interested in bolstering their forward depth. Pat and I are going to discuss that right after this.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes. That is Patrick Dampett, my co-host. You can follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. You can follow the show's Twitter at @LONSTORPenguins. You can follow Pat's Twitter at Synonym for Wet. Also, thank you all so much for making this your first listen / watch of the day. So, Penguins looks like they're still in on the Tomas Tatar sweepstake. Every time I think of Tomas
Tatar,
every time that video comes up of that Montreal Canadiens fan just doing the Tatar, it's probably one of the underrated funny videos of hockey Twitter. And it turns out it wasn't any reporter that really broke anything this weekend. It was a fan by the name of Matt Meager, someone who goes by Flux_CC on Twitter, found a interview deep in the catacombs of the internet. And Tatar basically just said, yeah, I've been in talks with the Penguins. And then a couple other people reported what they had been hearing and stuff. But overall, if you're asking my opinion, this makes all the sense in the world for the Penguins. We discussed it a little bit a couple of weeks ago on the show. Penguins don't have a true offensive threat in the bottom six right now. There could be one developing in Drew O'Connor, but he's still a little bit of an unknown right now, even though I want to see what he does this season. But with someone like Tatar, he can give you at least 15 to 17 goals, potentially upwards of 20 to 22 goals, someone who can be a constant threat in the offensive zone. And I think you can definitely get him on the cheaper side. The biggest thing is, though, does he still want term at this point, like maybe 2-3 years, or is he willing to settle on a 1-year term? I think that's the big question. Money-wise, the higher you go for him, the less players you're going to be able to keep on the roster on opening night. So say, Pat, you sign him to what? 1 year, $1 million. I'm just throwing this at the wall here. You can maybe keep 22 players on the roster, but then as that number goes up to maybe, I don't know, 2.5, $3 million, and $3 million is probably pushing it, or even 2.5 is probably pushing it. You may be only able to keep not 19, but 20 players, something like that. It starts getting a little complicated, especially with how Jake Gensel does not want to go on, or they're not going to put Gensel on LTIR. Do you see a way that they can make this work despite being up against the salary cap?
Well, this is the big challenge right now for the Penguins and for Kyle Dubas is that Tomas Tatar put up nearly 50 points last year, 20 goals. You have to pay for that in this modern era of the NHL because scoring is always at a premium. So I do think the way they get this done is term. And with the cap going up in next year, which is something we're going to talk about later in the show, but with the cap going up next year and with the fact that he's 32 years old, he put up nearly 50 points last year. If you can give him a reasonable, say, $2.5 million for the next 3 years, one, it's very movable in the future if he nosedives. But it's also a guy that right now, if you're in talks with him, you need to get this done. Because as you said, there aren't really many legitimate scoring threats in the bottom six right now. You have a couple that could be in Nylander and O'Connor, but largely unproven, largely untested. So you just don't know if those guys are going to develop into an offensive push in the bottom six, which is something they sorely need right now. I've written about it. I think that there are guys in the bottom six who can chip in, but the main selling point with the bottom six right now is that they're not going to get caved in defensively, which is fine. And it's an upgrade from last year because they got destroyed defensively when the bottom six was on the ice. So if I'm Dubas, I'm looking at maybe a 3-year deal here, 2.5-ish million. You know, it's a guy who we've talked about it a couple times on the show. We're into August now, and guys who are still available, like Tatar, who are still available, you have to kind of take what you're given at this point. Now you still have negotiating leverage because again, 20 points or 20 goals, 28 assists, 48 points in a full 82, that has value. But again, where have the offers been? So I think 2-3 years, $2.5 million I think that gets this done. And Dubas has done a good job building some forward depth. So if you have to hack a guy or two off, put them through waivers, lose them, I think you're okay.
This would also just close out what has been, I think, a really impressive offseason from Kyle Dubas so far anyway. If you can get this done, you not only will have improved the bottom six defensively, you'll have added an offensive threat down there as well. The bottom six will honestly just be completely remade, which is, I think, something that both of us have been wanting him or whoever was going to come in here to do, just because the bottom six was so bad this past season. I do think he's holding out for a little bit of term on his deal, especially after Pius Suter signed with the Vancouver Canucks over the weekend, 2-year deal, a little bit of money there. He was someone who I also had my eye on for the Penguins, but he goes to the Canucks. Very Jim Rutherford and Patrick Allvin signing there. I'm wondering when it comes to Tatar, regular season numbers are great. It's his playoff numbers that have been down a little bit. If you look at his playoff production overall, 7 goals, 13 points in 52 games. Not the greatest for someone who has played in a lot of playoff games overall. Do you think that's something that these teams are considering just because he hasn't produced when it's mattered most? Or is that just maybe not as big of a factor as I'm maybe reading into?
It's a red flag for me, certainly, because 52 games is not a small sample size. That's a lot of playoff games. And only being able to put up 13 points. Now, granted, he's only ever played his max playoff games played are 12, and that was last season with New Jersey. So again, like, the numbers aren't great, but at the same time, you do have to take into account that when he's been in the playoffs, he has not been in there long. So it's not like we have an extended run to really look at for him in the postseason. But again, you would hope that maybe he's got 10, 12 goals in total, maybe 10, 12 assists to go with it, because it's 52 games. And we also have to factor in, he's not a top guy. I don't say that as a shot. He's just not. He's not a top 6 forward, at least not anymore. So you don't need him to light the score sheet up, but you do need him to chip in just a little bit more. So with a team like the Penguins, who have their eyes on cup contention, that means they want to go on an extended run in the postseason. So they're going to need a little bit more out of them.
And I don't think he can't play in the top 6 in general. You can put him up there for a few games and he'll be just fine. For example, Jake Gensel misses 5 or 6 games. You can put Tatar up there. He'll get the job done. And then when Gensel is ready to come back, you can just slide Tatar down and he can play on the third line with, I don't know if they want Lars Eller there, which, I've made my thoughts clear on that numerous times on the show. Maybe Drew O'Connor, Matt Nieto, something like that. And honestly, when it comes to just his cap number, it really depends on what they want to do specifically with the backup goalie spot because of Nedeljkovic and Magnus Hellberg. So maybe, again, the lower the number, maybe the higher some of these players that could be on the team. Again, with 22, you also have waivers available to you, trades potentially before the season. Now, if the number's a bit higher, maybe that's Magnus Hellberg getting the backup job over Alex Nedeljkovic. That's going to be an underrated battle, I think, during training camp. And we'll touch on goalies a little later on in the show. But again, I'm all for it. It can really help the Penguins. It would solidify, honestly, an A offseason. It's funny. When this offseason started out, I gave Dubas about B-, C+, something like that, just because the forward signings, while they were fine, they weren't really moving the needle much in terms of getting more offense from players who aren't in the top 6. Now you've done that. Now that you've added Erik Karlsson, and if you were to sign Tatar, which brings you more offense down there, and there's really nothing much else you could possibly ask for when it comes to an offseason for someone who's really only been on the job for 2.5 months now.
No, not at all. And the way he has rebuilt the bottom 6, we said it on the show. I wrote about it on Penguins Perspectives. The way he's rebuilt this roster is incredible to watch, because it's not often you see a general manager wipe out his predecessor's mistakes this simply and this quickly, because that usually involves some form of tanking, and they are not doing that. So you add Tatar, I mean, this offseason goes from a B- to an A.
Oh, 100%. There's no doubt about that. And I'll be really curious to see if the signing is this week, next week, in August at all, into September. Camp is right now, I think we're 5 weeks away from training camp at this point. This is coming up really fast, which is
great. And by all accounts, last point on this is that it seems like there's a bit of a disconnect here of whether he's going to get a contract right away or if he's going to get a PTO with a kind of a like asterisk on it. Like, listen, it's a PTO and then we're going to sign you.
If Tomas Tatar gets a PTO, there is something seriously wrong with a lot of teams in this league because I can't even fathom that the talent that this player has, had 20 goals this past season, almost 50 points. The fact that he would get a PTO going into camp, even though it's just there in quotation marks, that's crazy to think about. But, we'll be staying focused on that heading into the next couple of weeks. That will wrap up this segment. Coming up after this break, Penguins are going to have quite a bit of cap space next year as well to go into free agency, and that free agency class right now is a massive step up from this year's free agency class. So we're going to discuss that coming up after this. But before we get to that, we have to discuss our friends at FanDuel. Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long, because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You can use these bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel, the official partner of the Locked On Podcast Network and the NFL. All right, we're back here in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am Hunter Hodes. That is Patrick Damp. Now, Pat, I understand free agency for next year is 12 and a half. That's 12 and a half months. Well, I just almost screwed up the math on that. About 10 and a half months away at this point. Again, this is why I'm not a math major here, people. But about 10 and a half months away next July 2024. And the class right now shaping up to be pretty good. And the Penguins, if they choose, they could be making at least a decent splash, even though they do have Jake Gensel to sign, and I think he's going to command at least 7.5 to 8 million per. But you look at the rest of the contracts that they have expiring next year. Jeff Carter at 3.125, he's not going to be coming back. Ren Pitlick, that's an unknown right now. We have to see how he plays, if he makes the team coming out of camp. Alex Nylander, that's not going to be a hard negotiation if the Penguins go down that road. You have Chad Riedel, who's a UFA, and he won't be getting that much money. Ty Smith is an RFA. He won't be getting that much of a raise. P.O. Joseph is one player at least who could get a decent raise if he has another really good year. I could see him getting to 2.5 million per season, something like that, if he has a really good year as a bottom pairing defenseman. Then you got Alex Nedeljkovic making 1.5 million. His contract is also up. So it's really just Jake Gensel, and then to a lesser extent, P.O. Joseph. They're going to have money to play with next year. And with how the Penguins are set up going into it, with the players that they will still have on the team, I think the Penguins are going to be an underrated destination for free agents next year. Even though the core is going to be a bit older, I still think good players will be like, you know what? I'm maybe going to come here for a couple of years, see if I can help them win a cup, and then maybe I can go get a payday elsewhere when the cap continues to rise. Because we all know the cap is going to go up next year, but it's only going to continue to go up as the years go by.
Yeah, you're going to see, at least right now, according to Cap Friendly's projections, a $4 million increase in the salary cap next year. So it's going to go from 83.5 to 87.5. And as it stands today, the Penguins are looking at just under 19 million in cap space. And that's obviously before whatever the Jake Gensel extension is. So let's operate under the fact that maybe they'll have like 10.5, 11 million in cap space going into next year. And there's going to be a good chunk of teams that are on the come up that are going to have much more. But Toronto was an attractive destination for more than just the guys that were on the roster when Kyle Dubas was there, because by all accounts, he put together an elite hockey organization in Toronto, and he's well on his way to doing that here in Pittsburgh. So you add up that, like you said, all the big names, even though they're aging, are locked up. You don't have to do anything with Crosby. Malkin and Letang are locked up. Erik Karlsson's locked up. Riley Smith's locked up. And they'll have an opportunity to bring in some real impact players. Now, I don't expect them to be on the huge names that are going to be available.
You're telling me Austin Matthews isn't going to come here just because Kyle Dubas is here?
Listen, that's a discussion we can have in like a year or two, because if Toronto keeps flaming out, who knows? But different discussion, different day. But, there's going to be some very, very good pieces on the market that put up 25, 30 goals that, are going to go out there, kind of like we're talking about with Tatar on a different level. They're going to go out there demanding a big raise, and there's going to be a lot of teams that balk at that. And when their value goes down, Kyle Dubas can say, hey, listen, we want to take the burden off of Crosby and Malkin. We want them to still be good, but we're going to need more help to keep this team in contention. So, come ride shotgun with these guys. And he's, by all accounts, very good at being a negotiator and I know people will look at a lot of the contracts in Toronto, but all of them lived up to it. So at this point, this next year could be a big offseason for the Penguins.
I agree. And, just going off what you said about the 10.5, 11 million, assuming Jake Gensel comes back, which I think we both think he will. You have P.O. Joseph's contract. If that's $2 million, something like that, or maybe even a little less, you're looking at what, 8.5, $9 million, something like that. You'll still have enough cap space to go out there and sign at least one impact player, maybe two, if you can get another one on discount. You look at that class right now. I mean, it's absolutely loaded. Even outside of Matthews, you got Steven Stamkos, you got Elias Pettersson. Well, he's an RFA from Vancouver. You got William Nylander there. They haven't really signed him back. Sam Reinhart, he's awesome. He's going to be a UFA. You have guys like, just going down the list here, Tyler Bertuzzi signed that 1-year term in Toronto. If he has a good year, I could definitely see the Penguins maybe having interest in him. You got someone like Teuvo Teravainen. You got Michael Backlund. Players like that, like not some of these, top line players, but some of these players that I just mentioned, even though they're, again, late 20s, maybe early 30s for some of these guys, they can come in here, ride shotgun with an aging Evgeny Malkin and Sidney Crosby, and I think they're still going to be elite players at that point. Well, maybe not like elite at the height of their power, but still insanely good players. You have Erik Karlsson, you have Chris Letang, you have the cap space. Why not go out there and try to make at least a little bit of a splash in free agency? It was a little bit different this year because the class wasn't that good. But if this class next year turns out to be awesome and a lot of these guys don't sign with their respective teams, I do think the Penguins are going to be right in there in the thick of it for some of these good players who usually don't get to market.
Yeah, and the other thing is you can also approach this in a similar way that I thought Kyle Dubas was going to approach this offseason, to where if you're going to have double-digit millions in cap space, you can weaponize that, because there's always going to be teams near the upper limit, regardless of how it goes, that are going to they're going to want to re-sign their big names. They're going to want to re-sign their stars, or they're going to need to re-sign key pieces on their roster. So you can sit there as Kyle Dubas and the Penguins and go, we got some room. You need some room. What if we take this guy off your hands? And you essentially get an impact player for pennies on the dollar for where you would, which would, in my opinion, is something you would want to do rather than sign somebody on the open market, because on the open market, regardless of the cap, the cap limit, values on July 1 and after are always inflated by a little bit.
It's funny you mentioned that, just taking players off of teams who are cap strong. Penguins just did that with Riley Smith, and they had to give up basically nothing for a player who I think is going to score 20 to 25 goals this upcoming season. So if they have the opportunity to do that again next year, I definitely think Dubas is going to take that. And, he's been able to move out some bad contracts. I know the Penguins really don't have many of those right now, but say, someone like, I don't know if this is going to happen, but say Brian Rust has another down year, for example. That contract may start to look a little bit dicey, because right now he's signed for the next 5 years, $5.125 million. He's 31 years old. If he continues on a downward trajectory, maybe you can try to find a taker for a player like that and maybe get some salary cap room and bring in someone else to replace him. That's just something way down the road. I'm hoping that does not happen, because I really like Brian Rust, but again, they don't have too many bad contracts right now, and one of the ones that they have is going to expire next year. But, in terms of a player who could be dealt next year if things go bad, Brian Rust, I think, would make sense in that department, which would also open up more cap space for the Penguins to use in trades or free agency.
And, another one I'm looking at, and even though Dubas has said he likes him and doesn't have really any designs to move him, is Marcus Pettersson. I mean, if P.O. Joseph has a big year, if Ty Smith emerges, Patterson becomes a little bit expendable, and it's a pretty affordable deal at $4 million. And you can, and he'll be a UFA in 25, 26. So he'd be a pending UFA. So you could probably get something for him if you wanted, if a team wanted to say trade for him and then extend him. So again, like there's flexibility here, which is incredible to say right now, considering where they were when this offseason began.
Ron Hextall and Brian Burke are not running the show anymore. That's for sure, because with the way they bungled the salary cap. But you make a good point with that as well. And hey, we're going to have to revisit this as free agency next year gets a little bit closer again. We're 10.5 months away. Finally got the math right.
There you go.
But
there you go.
Yeah, that wraps up this second segment. Coming up after this, we're going to dive into why the moves that Kyle Dubas made at goalie this offseason were not surprising in the slightest. Stick around for that. Coming up right after this. All right, we're back here in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes. That is Patrick Damp, my co-host. So, Kyle Dubas brought in quite a few goalies over the offseason. You got Magnus Hellberg, you got Alex Nedeljkovic, he re-signed Tristan Jarry, did ship out Casey DeSmith, but also brought in Garrett Sparks to play down on Wilkes-Barre, brought in, just really got a lot more depth at the position than what I think a lot of us are accustomed to. And when you look at some of these moves, or a good chunk of them, I should say, it honestly lines up with what he did when he was in Toronto by making some of these big gambles or big bets, whatever word you want to use, and seeing if they're going to work out. Something like a Frederik Andersen. We saw him do that in Toronto. We saw him use Peter Mrazek there. Matt Murray, Ilya Samsonov, the latter of which worked really well for the Maple Leafs this past season. So I don't think we should be surprised by any of this at all.
No, and I don't want this to have like a negative connotation, because I get what he's trying to do. I understand it. Tristan Jarry, but when he's healthy, by all accounts, we've seen he can be pretty solid. I also think that there was a good move for him psychologically, because if you're on a 1-year deal, if you're on an expiring deal, if you're on a prove it deal and you don't know where the next deal is going to be, it can hamper your performance. But again, we still don't know. And then you talk about guys like Mrazek, guys like Murray, now guys like Nedeljkovic. It's like you're hoping for a bounce back, because Nedeljkovic started pretty well when he came in with Detroit and then kind of tailed off. And now you're hoping, okay, was that because Detroit wasn't great, or is it more indicative of the goalie himself? Hellberg, same deal, kind of unproven, not a whole lot to talk about. So I don't want to say this is a weakness for Kyle Dubas, because it hasn't been disastrous, so to speak, but it also hasn't been great. Like, this might be the one part of him as a manager where he's not as strong as he is with forwards and defensemen. So I think Jarry's going to have a bounce back year. What worries me again is that if he doesn't, there's a question mark behind him. And that was kind of the problem the last couple of years with the Penguins, was Jarry could be the guy, but sometimes he falters. Sometimes he gets hurt. And you need to have somebody reliable behind him, because as much as people weren't a fan of Casey DeSmith, I always said he's a pretty typical NHL backup. But given the role he was in, where sometimes he had to become a spot starter, he's not that guy.
And also just the fact that you couldn't sell the fan base and everyone on bringing back that tandem for another year. That's why this whole Erik Karlsson trade, basically had to happen, and where DeSmith is going to another team where he's going to have a chance to start quite a few games. The Canadians have some question marks in goal. You just couldn't sell that to the fan base. And with Nedeljkovic this past season, played in 15 games, 13-5-7, .895 save percentage. Last season, Detroit played 59 games, was 20-24-9, .901 save percentage. So a little bit better in terms of his save percentage, but you go back to his time in Carolina, his best year there, 23 games, 23 starts, 15-5-3, .932 save percentage. If that's the version the Penguins can get this season, man, that will solve, I think, quite a few problems in terms of their goaltending, situation. And obviously, if Tristan Jarry stays healthy as well, that will also solve a big one too. But I agree with you there. He just can't fall for this season. We all know it's a big risk He just has to show that he can stay healthy, because when he's healthy, he's one of the better starters in the league. And if you compare him with someone like Nedeljkovic, who just a couple of years ago was one of the better starters in the league in Carolina, and I understand the Hurricanes play a very goalie-friendly system. Let's be real here. They do a great job of suppressing high danger shots, just keeping their opponents to the outside, very goalie-friendly. You come to the Penguins now, it's not as good. It's decent. It's better than Detroit, don't get me wrong, but it's still decent. Can that help him bounce back? Curious to see that. And also, of course, if he wins the job. But I think there is some untapped potential here for this tandem if both can stay healthy and get back to the play we've seen them play at.
And for Nedeljkovic, say he wins the job, right? Say he becomes the backup. For him, as long as he can find a medium between, his big year in Carolina and his faltering in Detroit, that's all he's going to need to be. 910, 915, 920 ceiling. He's not playing every single game. He's not a spot starter. He's playing every 10th game or so. That's great. That's what you need. If he has to be a spot starter for a couple weeks, if he finds that happy medium, that's fine. Because I say this about the Penguins all the time. If you're a goalie for the Pittsburgh Penguins, you do not need to be a Vezina candidate. You don't have to steal games. And this is where Jarry faltered the last couple of years. And same with Matt Murray before him. You don't have to be a Vezina candidate. You don't have to steal games. You just have to not give them away. If you aren't giving games away, the Penguins are a franchise that always have an amount of firepower to where you just need to be able to keep the other team under 2 to 3 goals.
I feel like I've been saying that for a decade now, or probably longer than that.
I mean, that's the franchise's history. You look at the guys who have been goalies, especially when they win. Sure, Barrasso, Fleury, and Murray had incredible runs and incredible moments in those runs, but they weren't the reason that they won. They were good enough to give this team a chance. And as a Penguins goalie, that's all you have to be asked of, is just give your team a chance to win. It's the old Jim Craig line from the 1980 team where he said, my goal when I stepped between the pipes was just to give my team a chance to win. And that's it.
And it's funny, just even looking at the past few seasons history where the Penguins have lost in the first round. They haven't obviously gone past the first round since 2018 when they lost to the Capitals in the second round. When you look at some of these series losses, 2019, I think, was just a collective failure. I'm going to throw that in the garbage.
Oh yeah. That was top to bottom.
Yeah. You look at the COVID failure, the COVID bubble, when they played the Canadiens, Matt Murray wasn't good. The next year you play the Islanders. Tristan Jarry gave that away. The next year you're playing Louis Domingue and he couldn't make one more save for the Penguins to win that series. And then Tristan Jarry has to come in, play on a broken foot. I'm not really going to criticize him that much for that because he's playing on a broken foot. But when it comes down to it, their failures in the playoffs for the most part, and I'll probably put 85 to 90% of it, has been because they haven't gotten average goaltending. So many people out there like to make up other excuses. The core players went cold. This guy didn't play that well, blah, 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 blah. But when it comes down to it, the meat of the issues was the goaltending. And if you fix that, this team, I think, can go on at least another long run. I hope, at least.
I mean, I look back at the Rangers series. I think it was game 6 because it was at PPG. Louis Domingue gave up a goal from the blue line. They took a shot, it hit his shoulder and bounced in behind him. That is the epitome of make a save. I'm not asking you to steal the game. Again, Penguins goalie, you don't need to steal games. It's nice if you can, but you don't have to. And that is just a make a save.
Right. I mean, again, I'm not asking goalies here to be Dominic Hasek, Patrick Waugh, any of these all-time greats. Just give the team average goaltending, let the stars cook, let the bottom 6 play well, defense plays well, and this team should be fine. That's just how I see it, at least. But I think that's all we have for this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to / watch this episode of the show. Pat and I will be back with another episode on Wednesday. We're already halfway through August, which is crazy. Training camp is going to be here in the blink of an eye. 5 weeks, whatever, how many it is. The season's about 2 months away at this point. This is going to absolutely fly by. I know it's the dog days of summer, but really appreciate all of you keep listening to / watching the show. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back with another episode on Wednesday.